When you think about the new DCU, the first name that comes to mind is Superman, and the second is Peacemaker. That makes no sense, because he had zero presence in pop culture before 2021. He had only starred in 2 comics that no one read, and they had killed him off and brought him back without anyone noticing. But now he's popping up everywhere. He has one of the best superhero shows ever made, and even his pet eagle has its own comic. So how did this total nobody become one of DC's biggest stars? Let's find out. It all started back in 1966, when writer Joe Gill and artist Pat Boyette introduced him in a spy team comic called Fighting 5, published by Charlton Comics. Christopher Smith was shown as a diplomat and a hardcore pacifist so dedicated to peace that he was willing to do whatever it took to achieve world peace, even if it meant using violence. That contradiction was the most interesting thing about him, and it's an idea that stuck around to this day. After just 2 appearances in Fighting 5, he got his own solo comic. But even with a whole bunch of helmets with crazy powers, he couldn't grab people's attention. Charlton cancelled the comic after only 5 issues because of poor sales, and they buried the character for almost 20 years. Peacemaker should have disappeared for good after this massive flop.
Everybody hates my guts.
But then DC showed up. In the mid-80s, DC Comics bought the rights to the Charlton characters, including Captain Atom, Blue Beetle, The Question, and our guy Peacemaker. They all got added to the main DC universe during Crisis on Infinite Earths, which was the editor's way of cleaning up the canon and rearranging everything so they could start playing with their new toys. Since Peacemaker was a nobody, DC could do whatever they wanted with him. But no one really saw the appeal of this peace-obsessed fanatic, except Alan Moore, best known as the greatest writer of all time. Moore pitched a comic called Who Killed the Peacemaker, where Chris Smith was gonna die in the first few pages, and the rest of the Charlton characters would investigate his murder. DC editor Dick Giordano liked the idea because it was fresh and worked as a deconstruction of the superhero genre, but he wasn't thrilled about the fact that several Charlton characters would either die or end up unusable by the end of the comic, especially since DC had just bought them and wanted to make the most of that investment. So he suggested Moore swap out the whole cast for original characters. Peacemaker became the base inspiration for the comedian, who also took a few elements from Nick Fury and Captain America. The comic ended up being called Watchmen, which became one of the best-selling comics of all time, and for many people, the greatest comic ever. If Peacemaker had been part of it, he would have become famous instantly, since the comedian's smiley face button turned into a major pop culture symbol. It's one of those rare cases where the copy became a star way before the original. But by leaving Peacemaker out of Watchmen, DC gave him a shot at becoming an icon decades later. In 1988, just a year after Watchmen came out, writer Paul Kuppenberg gave Peacemaker a new origin in a 4-issue miniseries. Kuppenberg reimagined Chris Smith as the son of a… how do I say this without getting demonetized? An evil German guy.
Worst fake mustache I've ever seen.
Chris was traumatized by the abuse he suffered as a kid, and now he didn't use non-lethal weapons like he did in his early Charlton days. Instead, he was a super violent vigilante with serious mental health issues. He believed the souls of everyone he killed lived inside his helmet, an interesting take on survival's guilt. Peacemaker wasn't chasing peace as a way to make the world better anymore. Now, it was about redemption and trying to escape his dad's fascist legacy. In just 3 years, Peacemaker had a second shot at becoming a pop culture hit, but nobody gave a shuck about this comic. Kupperberg's reboot was cool, but by the late 80s, edgy anti-heroes were everywhere. Peacemaker got lost in the crowd next to violent vigilantes that were way more appealing, like the Punisher. Then, the Image Comics wave hit in the 90s, flooding comic shops with buff anti-heroes loaded with pouches, and suddenly no one was paying attention to the Silver Helmet nutjob. There were just too many anti-heroes to pick from, like Deadpool and Cable, and Peacemaker didn't stand out. He seemed doomed to fade into obscurity again, just like it did back in the Charlton days. But at least DC didn't completely toss him in the trash. Sure, he didn't headline another solo comic for the next 34 years. That's a pretty clear sign that DC didn't want to take a risk on a character nobody cared about. But he did pop up here and there in the Vigilante comics, and showed up as a side character in paramilitary groups like Checkmate, the Suicide Squad, and Amanda Waller's Shadow Fighters.
Who?
Nobody knows about those guys, so don't worry about it. Anyway, in 1993, the extremely popular Shadow Fighters were sent to take down the villain Eclipso, also known as the Angel of Vengeance. In issue 13 of Eclipso, the whole team, including Peacemaker, was brutally killed. Chris blew up into a million pieces along with the helicopter he was flying. But this wasn't a big TV event like Superman's death. It didn't become a record-breaking comic like the death of Spider-Man, and it definitely didn't break the internet like Captain America's death. Nobody cared that Chris got slaughtered because he was a nobody, and it wasn't one of the typical fake-out deaths we see all the time in comics, where the character magically comes back 2 issues later, like they just did with Ms. Marvel. This felt like a deserved ending for a character that had never been relevant, killed off by a second-rate villain just for shock value. This really should have been the end of the line for Peacemaker. But like Dr. Manhattan said, nothing ever ends. In 1999, Jeff Jones brought him back in Day of Judgment, which was full of wild magic stuff. Once again, DC dropped an event just to fix the canon. They do this every 5 years and there's no sign they're gonna stop. Back to Peacemaker, he didn't really get a relevant role until 2006, and even then, not in his own comic. Instead, he showed up as a mentor to Jaime Reyes, the new Blue Beetle. It sounded like the dumbest idea ever, since Peacemaker didn't seem like the mentor type, but it was a nice callback to the Charlton days, since Peacemaker and the original Blue Beetle came from the same publisher.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
Writers Keith Giffen and John Rogers turned Chris into the classic mentor who doesn't want to be a mentor but ends up being the perfect one for a teen who just fused with an alien scarab. They toned down the edginess a bit and gave him some dry, deadpan humor that had never been used for him before, but it worked great, especially because of the bond he had with Jaime and his family. You'd think Peacemaker's popularity would have shot up after that, especially since Jaime connected with younger readers. He even showed up in a bunch of Young Justice episodes. But Peacemaker still didn't catch on. He sold so poorly, he didn't even appear on the covers of Jaime's regular series. They even redesigned him and ditched the costume. He was just some dude on a motorcycle, because visually, they tried to make him look as different from the Charlton character as possible. They barely even called him by his vigilante name. So if you didn't already know this white-haired guy was Peacemaker, you wouldn't have a clue. While the comedian was more popular than ever thanks to the live-action Watchmen, Peacemaker had to settle for being a side character in the Blue Beetle comics. Once his mentor phase ended, Chris went right back to where he was in the 90s, just another forgettable face in the Suicide Squad and Inferior 5, usually grumbling while taking orders from Amanda Waller. He was doomed to stay stuck forever as a nobody, not even worthy of making it onto a comic book cover.
What about me? You're nobody. Why?
But then James Gunn changed the character's fate for good. When he joined DC in 2018, Gunn decided to make a sort of soft reboot/sequel to Suicide Squad, mainly because he felt right at home working with teams of antiheroes dealing with childhood trauma. Since the idea was to push things way further than he could do at Marvel, he picked a bunch of totally unknown characters that he could rewrite however he wanted without anyone complaining. If the characters didn't have fans, no one would get mad if he changed them completely to fit the story he wanted to tell. And since they were all pretty low profile, he could kill off almost everyone by the end of the movie without messing up the rest of the DC universe, which at that point was a pretty big mess. The only character with plot armor and any kind of fame was Harley Quinn. The rest of the squad was made up of nobodies: Bloodsport, Ratcatcher, King Shark, Polka Dot Man, and Peacemaker. Peacemaker. I know more guys show up, but those were the main ones that actually mattered. Gunn pulled bits from every version of the character across his entire comic book history. He made him a walking contradiction, like in the Charlton days, gave him childhood trauma, and made him super violent, like in Copperberg's miniseries, and added some ridiculous humor, like in the Jaime Reyes comics. Originally, Gunn wanted Dave Bautista for the role, since they are good friends, but Bautista had to turn it down because Netflix was throwing big money at him for Army of the Dead, so Gunn went with John Cena, who barely had any acting experience at the time. But without John Cena, Peacemaker would have never become an icon.
He does exactly what I do, but better.
No one really took him seriously as an actor, but Gunn was so impressed working with him that he ended up changing part of the script. In the early scripts, Peacemaker was supposed to turn into a full-on antagonist in the third act, trying to protect America's image, and then get killed by Bloodsport. Gunn gave him the same ending he got back in the 90s, but he decided to keep Peacemaker alive, thinking it'd be a waste to kill off a character with that much potential, especially one played by such a solid actor. A lot of people hated Peacemaker because of his attitude, and for killing Rick Flag Jr., which showed that the character was well written, and that Cena nailed the performance of an unhinged Captain America. I remember seeing tons of comments from people saying they couldn't believe Gunn let that jerk live and not Rick Flag. But Gunn took the right shot. For the first time ever, Peacemaker had stepped out of the comics and become a real topic of conversation among superhero fans. Maybe he wasn't the biggest character in the movie, and sadly, the Suicide Squad bombed at the box office. But that was because of the pandemic, DC's bad rep at the time, and the 2021 Warner Brothers experiment of streaming and releasing in theaters at the same time. Still, Chris was on the posters, and people were starting to care about him, which had never happened before.
They love me.
Thanks to the movie's good critical reception, Warner gave Gunn the green light to make a spin-off show for HBO Max, hoping it would help boost the platform. And out of all the characters he could have chosen, Gunn picked Peacemaker because he wanted to keep tapping into Cena's talent. This decision got a lot of pushback from fans, since at the time, Peacemaker was pretty much seen as a villain. A lot of people thought Cena only did a good job because he was just playing himself, and they didn't think he had the chops to carry a whole show on his own. But Cena proved everyone wrong. Peacemaker Season 1 turned into a redemption story in two ways. First, for the character. Right from episode 1, we see that he didn't choose to be a jerk. That was the only path he knew, thanks to the way his dad raised him. By the end of Season 1, we start to root for him and hope he becomes a better person, despite all the messed up stuff he's done. And second, it was a redemption for Cena too. He proved he could act, and do it across a range of emotional tones. Gunn took a lot of inspiration from the 80s comics, bringing in Vigilante as Peacemaker's partner. He also leaned into the hallucinations from Copperberg's run. Plus, he cranked up the dark humor way more than in the Suicide Squad, making Peacemaker stand out from anything else DC had done in live action. And fans ended up loving that combo. But since the character didn't have much of a reputation, the first episode only drew about 638,000 US households in its first 4 days, according to Samba TV. That was lower than any Marvel show at the time, but still, it had more viewers than anything Peacemaker had ever headlined before. Thanks to great word of mouth, the ratings climbed every week, and the season finale had the highest single-day viewership for any HBO Max original episode. The show turned into a massive hit for the platform.
Wow.
From that point on, Peacemaker started showing up everywhere. In 2022, he starred in a non-canon comic called Disturbing the Peace, written by Garth Ennis, the same guy behind The Boys. He retold Peacemaker's origin with quite a few changes, and like everything Ennis does, he was super violent and cynical. Chris also headlined a miniseries called Peacemaker Tries Hard by Kyle Starks, which basically copied the tone of the HBO show. For the first time ever, Peacemaker starred in 2 separate comics comics in the same year. And that was just the beginning. In 2024, he was added as a guest character in Mortal Kombat 1, using the same design from the show. Eagle Eye showed up as his loyal sidekick, and they even included his different helmets with special abilities. This was a huge milestone for Peacemaker, because Mortal Kombat only brings in guest characters who made a serious impact in pop culture, like Omni-Man, Homelander, or the Terminator. Peacemaker was now one of the big names. That same year, he made the jump to animation, but not in the US. He had a major role in the Suicide Squad Isekai, an anime that didn't make much noise outside of Japan. But still, Japanese studios thought this guy was popular enough to land an anime appearance before Green Lantern or Flash. In 2025, Gunn gave him a quick cameo in Superman, where Peacemaker comments on the Kryptonians' no-kill rule and calls it bullshit. Both times I saw the movie in theaters, the crowd went wild, just like what happens with Marvel cameos. But 5 years ago, it would have been unthinkable for people to clap their hands for a Peacemaker cameo like it was the return of Andrew Garfield or Tobey Maguire. The character earned that kind of hype thanks to John Cena's charisma and James Gunn's killer writing, which made audiences care about a total nobody who had never sold a single comic. The funny thing is, if Dave Bautista had taken the role, none of this would have happened. He would have been killed off in the Suicide Squad, and that would have been the end of it. But thanks to John Cena, even your aunt knows who Peacemaker is. Taking advantage of Superman's release, Fortnite dropped a Peacemaker skin, which caused way more buzz than the other Suicide Squad characters that have been available since 2021. Peacemaker was finally more popular than Harley Quinn. He had become the most important member of the Suicide Squad, and one of the most recognizable faces of the new DCU. And the second season of his show was still underway. Right before the new season dropped, DC released a 5-issue miniseries starring Vigilante and Eagle Eye, which served as an official prequel. Before the first issue came out, the only DC pet who had ever headlined their own comic was Crypto, Superman's dog, with 70 years of history behind him. But Peacemaker had gotten so popular, Vigilante was now his sidekick, which was the total opposite of how it was back in the 80s. And his pet could now carry a comic on its own. That brought us to Season 2, which made way more noise than the first one. The premiere pulled in 712,000 US households in its first few days, and Samba TV reported a 22% jump in viewership compared to the Season 1 finale. Plus, it scored a wild 99% critic rating on Rotten Tomatoes, making it one of the highest rated shows ever. The number dipped a bit once more people weighed in, but it's still a show loved by both critics and fans.
I am very, very great.
Season 2 kept the hilarious moments coming, and delivered great character development too. Gunn explored a universe where Peacemaker turned into a beloved hero because his dad never abused him. Of course, that alternate reality ended up being a world where the bad German guys won, a nod to the 80s comics. But Gunn tackled the multiverse in a way that felt way fresher than what we've seen in recent Marvel stuff. And I know, the season finale left some fans a bit disappointed because it felt more like the first episode of Season 3 than a real wrap-up to the story we were watching. Still, Peacemaker remains a sensation, and fans are hyped for whatever's next, whether it's a third season, a spin-off, or an appearance in Man of Tomorrow. He's become one of the most popular anti-heroes in the world, standing shoulder to shoulder with Deadpool, Wolverine, and Punisher. But how is it that John Cena made it big in DC and The Rock didn't, when their careers are almost the same? I break it down in this video.